This move immediately opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, fighting for control of the center and preparing to develop pieces rapidly. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a complex and asymmetrical opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn advantage and aims for counterplay on the queenside. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a complex and rich defense where white aims to establish central control and develop pieces rapidly, while black seeks counterplay on the queenside. This move initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, a solid and popular response that prepares to challenge white's central pawn with nc6 and potentially e5 later. This move challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to open the center and create active piece play for white. This capture initiates the open Sicilian, a dynamic and strategically complex variation where black aims to exploit the open c-file and create counterplay against white's central pawn majority. This move correctly recaptures the pawn and enters the main lines of the open Sicilian, maintaining central tension and preparing for further development. This move, developing the knight towards the center and attacking white's e4 pawn, signals a transition into the popular open Sicilian, a dynamic and combative opening where both sides fight for central control. This move maintains white's central pawn majority and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, common in many variations of the open Sicilian. This move, often called the Najdorf variation, prepares to control the b5 square and potentially expand on the queenside later with a queenside pawn push. This move, bg5, is a key piece of theory in the Sicilian defense, specifically leading to the Velimirovic attack or Richter-Rauser attack variations, aiming to pressure black's knight and potentially create structural weaknesses later. This move prepares to challenge the central tension, intending to recapture on d4 with the bishop and prepare to develop the queenside pieces. This move aims to control the center and prepare for a kingside attack, embracing the aggressive spirit of the Yugoslav attack in the Sicilian Najdorf. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing for kingside castling and reinforcing the pawn on e6 while indirectly supporting the potential d5 break. The move qf3 aims to develop the queen aggressively, connecting the rooks and supporting a potential kingside attack, while also preparing to castle queenside or keep the king in the center for now. This move, qc7, is a standard response in the classical Sicilian, preparing to support the d6 pawn and potentially develop the queen to a more active square later, while also clearing the way for the c8 bishop. Castling queenside initiates a sharp game, preparing to launch a pawn storm against black's kingside and placing white's king in a safer position relative to the central pawn tension. This move develops the knight towards the center and prepares to contest the d4 square, a common idea in this variation of the Sicilian defense to support further pawn advances or prepare for a knight retreat. This aggressive pawn push on the kingside aims to gain space and potentially create attacking chances, but it weakens the king's position and could lead to tactical complications if not well supported. Black challenges white's aggressive kingside pawn push by immediately counter-attacking on the queenside, aiming to exploit the space white has surrendered. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a bishop for a knight, weakening black's kingside pawn structure and potentially creating an isolated d-pawn for black. After further exchanges, this recapture resolves the immediate threat to the knight on d4 and continues development, preparing to castle queenside and engage in the pawn storm that white has initiated. This move develops the knight to its most active square, aiming to control the central e5 square and prepare for a kingside counterplay or a potential exchange on f6. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, attacking the black knight and preparing to open lines for attack on the kingside by potentially forcing g6 or h6. This move aggressively challenges white's knight, forcing it to retreat and gaining space on the queenside, potentially disrupting white's king's safety. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a kingside attack while potentially defending against black's queenside expansion. Black develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing to contest the central squares and potentially pressure white's king if white overextends. This prophylactic move prepares to clear the c1 square for the queen or rook should the kingside pawn storm falter, while also allowing the king to escape potential checks along the newly opened a2-8 diagonal. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, supporting potential pawn breaks and controlling key dark squares while eyeing white's king safety. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it supports the f-pawn advance and eyes the kingside, while also potentially preparing to contest the d-file or swing over to the queenside. The move qg4 aims to exploit the vulnerable h7 pawn and potentially set up a discovered attack or queen sacrifice on g7 after further pawn advances. This capture continues the tactical exchange on the kingside and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn and reactivates the knight, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king after the pawn exchange. This move prepares to defend the king by creating a pawn shield and potentially opens the g-file for counterplay if white continues an attack on the kingside. This exchange removes black's active bishop and simplifies the position, allowing white to gain initiative by exploiting the open g-file. This move recaptures the piece but centralizes the queen, which may become vulnerable to attack from white's developed pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, increasing pressure on black's kingside and preparing potential tactical incursions or supporting an attack with the g-pawn. Black finally castles, securing the king's safety after a series of pawn advances and exchanges that have opened up lines and created tactical imbalances. This move activates the rook to a strong central file, preparing to potentially disrupt black's queenside structure and create threats against the enemy king if an exchange sacrifice is possible. The move 24, bg4 is a thematic repositioning, aiming to activate the bishop to a more central and attacking square, potentially targeting the weak f5 pawn or supporting further queenside advances. This move centralizes the knight, aiming to improve its position and potentially exploit the open d-file, while also preparing for defensive maneuvers. This move seeks to open lines and create attacking chances against white's king by challenging the pawn chain and potentially exposing the central d-file. This move reinforces the central pawn structure, prepares to defend the d3 pawn, and offers a defensive option on the queenside should black's attack materialize there. This move opens up the d-file for black's rook, creating attacking potential against white's king and central pawns, while also preparing to potentially double rooks or support future pawn advances. This recapture on d7 is necessary to regain material equality, but it opens the d-file for white's rooks and leaves black's queenside pawns vulnerable to attack. This move repositions the rook from the active e file to the even more potent d file, preparing to attack black's weakened d-pawn and potentially support a kingside initiative or consolidate defensively. This move completes black's rook lift, bringing the rook to the same open file as white's remaining rook, preparing to contest control of the decisive central file. This pawn thrust aims to open lines towards black's king, leveraging the queenside pawn weaknesses created by black's early pawn advances and creating attacking chances. This move centralizes the queen, bringing it into a more active position to support potential pawn pushes and exert pressure on white's kingside while preparing to defend against white's advancing h-pawn. This move centralizes the queen, creating immediate threats to the d6 pawn and putting pressure on black's queenside defenses, while also preparing to redeploy the rook on the d-file. This move simplifies the position, trading queens and entering an endgame where white's active rook on the 7th rank and black's slightly exposed king become more prominent factors. The rook's redeployment to d4 aims to contest the open d-file and potentially restrict white's remaining pieces, offering a more active role for the rook in the endgame. This move aims to create a protected passed pawn on circa 5, which can become a dangerous attacking piece if black cannot properly contain it. Black captures the pawn, activating the rook on an open file and aiming to simplify into a potentially favorable endgame. With material equality, this pawn thrust aims to create a dangerous passed pawn on c6, forcing black to expend valuable material or positional resources to stop it. This move, bc8, strategically repositions the bishop to reinforce the queenside and prepare for potential counterplay against white's now advanced c-pawn. This move 34, road 6 aims to activate the rook on the open file and pressure black's weak pawn structure, potentially creating threats against the king or gaining material. Black's move 34, rc4 aims to exploit the open c-file and potentially create mating threats against white's king, while also offering a trade of rooks to simplify into a more favorable endgame. The king steps away from the dangerous files and into a safer square, preparing to support the queenside pawns and potentially activate itself in the endgame. The king moves to a safer square on g7, away from the d-file and potential checks, while preparing to support the rook on d4. The king activates to a more central square, preparing to support the pawn advances and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move repositions the rook to attack the pawn on c6, aiming to create further complications and potentially exploit weaknesses in white's pawn structure. The move 37, na2 aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, likely e4 or d4, to participate in controlling the center and supporting potential pawn pushes. This move reroutes the rook to a more active position, aiming to support the pawn advance on the queenside and potentially create threats against white's king. The move red 1 aims to connect the rooks on the central files, creating a more coordinated defensive structure and preparing to contest the open d-file for potential future action. This move activates the rook to attack the enemy king and creates threats on the second rank. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to contest control of the d-file and support potential pawn pushes or attacks on black's weakened kingside. This move aims to trade off white's active rook on d6, simplifying the position and opening lines for black's pieces, while also attempting to exploit white's weakened pawn structure after the pawn exchanges. The material is now equal, and white's king is exposed while black's pawns on the queenside are on the verge of becoming Dangerous passed pawns. This move, though seemingly passive, aims to consolidate the rook's position on the 7th rank, potentially preparing for further coordinated attacks or defending against white's own pawn pushes. This move aims to centralize the rook on the now open d-file, challenging black's control and preparing to potentially contest or advance the c-pawn in the endgame. This move by black, placing the rook on f2, aims to activate the rook and target white's vulnerable f-pawn, potentially creating a passed pawn on the f-file or forcing white into defensive concessions. This move aims to activate the rook on the d-file, potentially creating threats against black's kingside or centralizing the rook for future defensive or offensive operations. This move aims to promote the pawn, creating a passed pawn that now requires significant attention from white to prevent its further advance and potential queenship. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active central square, intending to support the promotion of the e-pawn and pressure black's compromised king position. The bishop moves to f5 to attack the white queen and prepare to recapture the pawn on c6, aiming to create counterplay. This move finally creates a dangerous passed pawn on c7, which will require black's full attention and will greatly restrict their piece's mobility. This move promotes a pawn, creating a new queen and fundamentally altering the material balance to white's overwhelming advantage. This move is a resignation as white has just promoted a pawn to a queen, while black has no immediate way to stop it and is down significant material. This endgame transition sees white simplifying into a winning position due to black's compromised pawn structure and the decisive passed pawn on the c-file. This move, by recapturing the pawn with the bishop, aims to reactivate the bishop on a central diagonal, while also preventing white from forcing a further pawn advance with a timely f5. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, leading to an endgame where white has a decisive material advantage with an extra pawn. This move simplifies the material, accepting the loss of the bishop for 2 pawns and aiming to exploit the resulting queen and pawn endgame with black's slightly less active king. This pawn capture on d3 secures white's central passed pawn and creates an opportunity to activate the rook on the 7th rank. This endgame is decided by pawn races, and capturing black's passed pawn on the queenside is crucial to stop its advance. The rook's advance to d5 aims to block the passed c-pawn and potentially establish a defensive outpost, though it concedes the crucial c-file to white's remaining rook. This pawn move aims to create space and prevent white's king from reaching the kingside, while also preparing for potential pawn advances later in the endgame. This pawn capture on g6 creates a passed pawn on h6, which now threatens to advance and become a queen. The king must escape the central outpost of the rook and immediately seek safety on the kingside, as the passed pawn on c7 presents a significant threat. This move aims to activate the queenside majority by preparing to advance the a-pawn, which could create a passed pawn and a new source of counterplay in the endgame. With the opponent's king exposed and white's pawn structure weakened, black's move aims to create a passed pawn and an attacking force by advancing the g-pawn to clear the way for the king to potentially become more active or to support further pawn pushes. This rook move aims to control the critical c-file, aiming to restrict black's king's mobility and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move aims to activate the rook and prepare for potential action on the c-file, while also supporting the g-pawn's advance. The move kc5 aims to activate the king by bringing it closer to the center. preparing to support the passed pawn and contest the important central squares against black's rook and king.